Ever stop and think about where our sense of right and wrong really comes from?
Mm-hmm.
Or why family stuff can get so messy sometimes?
Yeah.
Today, we're going right back to the beginning, really digging into Genesis chapters 3 and 4.
Foundational chapter.
Exactly. We've got a great stack of material here, historical background, looking at some ancient myths they might be, talking with.
Right, the cultural conversation.
Yeah, and some really fascinating questions these texts bring up, plus how people have tried to make sense of them over time.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is, because these aren't just simple stories, are they? They're really foundational for how we understand, well, the human condition.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to unpack the key ideas in these chapters and maybe clear up some common misunderstandings that have sort of stuck to them.
And what's fascinating right off the bat is how these early bits of Genesis really set the stage for so much that comes later in the Hebrew Bible and, beyond. Genesis being the first book, it's part of the Pentateuch. Traditionally, people said Moses wrote it.
Right, that classic view.
But modern biblical scholarship, it leans more towards Genesis and the whole Pentateuch actually being woven together from different sources, different traditions over quite a long time.
Interesting. So not just one author, one moment.
Probably not. And chapters 3 and 4, they fit into what scholars call primeval history. That's Genesis 1 through 11.
Ah, okay.
And these chapters are really crucial for establishing the whole theological outlook, the worldview of the ancient Israelites.
Okay, so let's unpack that phrase, primeval history. And this idea of them being explanatory narrative. Sounds like we shouldn't read them like a modern history textbook.
Exactly right. Think of them more like etiologies.
Etiologies.
Yeah, stories that explain the origins of things. Why do we suffer? Why do we know right from wrong? Where did farming come from? Or cities? Genesis 3 and 4 offer answers.
Ah, I see. So they're explaining the why behind the human experience.
Pretty much. They tackle these fundamental aspects of life as the ancient Israelites understood them. Consequences of choices, morality, hardship. It's all in there.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Our sources say these chapters weren't written in a vacuum.
No, definitely not.
They show ancient Israel interacting with the cultures around them, Mesopotamia especially. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. We'll take the whole paradise lost idea in Genesis 3. You find echoes of that in Sumerian myths, like the story of Dilmun.
Dilmun.
Yeah, it's described as this sort of pure, timeless place. And then there's the Epic of Gilgamesh, hugely influential Mesopotamian story.
Right, Gilgamesh. Heard of that.
It also wrestles with mortality, human limits. Things you definitely see in Genesis.
Yeah.
Even the serpent figure. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, snakes could symbolize all sorts of things: chaos, wisdom, danger.
So a familiar symbol.
A very familiar symbol. But Genesis takes that symbol and kind of reworks it, gives it a specific role within its own monotheistic moral framework.
So the big takeaway is they're using familiar ideas, but giving them a unique Israelite spin.
That's a great way to put it. And Genesis 4, the Cain and Abel story, that might tap into some real-world stuff from back then.
Like what?
Well, Cain's the farmer, right? Working the soil. Abel's the shepherd, more nomadic. That contrast could reflect actual social or economic tensions, maybe even tribal conflicts between settled farming communities and pastoral groups.
Never thought of it that way. Okay, so like any really old, influential text, myths and misunderstandings pop up.
Always happens.
Our sources flag a few key ones for Genesis 3 and 4. Let's tackle those. First up, the idea that Eve gets all the blame for the fall.
Ah, yes. That's a big one, and really important to get straight. Look, later interpretations, sometimes they did pin it mainly on Eve.
Right.
But the Hebrew text itself, it's more balanced. Adam is right there with her. He makes the same choice.
He wasn't tricked or anything.
He was present. He participated. And God holds both of them accountable in the narrative. So it's really about shared responsibility.
Okay, shared responsibility. Good point. What about the serpent? Everyone thinks serpent equals Satan, right?
It's probably the most common association today, yeah. But it's actually a later interpretation.
Later.
Much later. It develops over centuries, really becoming strong in the period between the Old and New Testaments, and then in the New Testament itself.
So in Genesis 3 itself,
it just says the serpent is portrayed as cunning, a tempter, a creature that makes you doubt God's word, but it's not explicitly identified as, the cosmic embodiment of evil. That's a crucial difference in the original context.
Okay, so just the serpent, got it. And the whole idea of a literal fall, like from perfect innocence into sin.
Well, some traditions definitely read it that way, very literally. But the story has so many symbolic elements. Many scholars see it more as a theological narrative. It's about a shift in human understanding, gaining that knowledge of good and evil.
So less a historical event, more a story about gaining moral awareness.
Exactly. A transition to moral agency, with all the complexities that brings. Not necessarily a drop from utter perfection.
Right. And, okay, the classic question. Cain's wife.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The population puzzle.
If Adam and Eve were the first and only people, where did Cain find a wife? And the text mentions other people later on, too.
It does. And that puzzle really underlines the point that Genesis 4 isn't trying to be a literal anthropological record of the first family tree.
So don't read it like a census report.
Definitely not. The focus is theological, it's moral, it's exploring jealousy, sin, God's judgment, God's mercy. The existence of other people is just part of the narrative backdrop for those themes. The story works on a different level.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've busted some myths. Now let's dig into the deeper questions these chapters raise. Maybe look closely at some key verses. First, that knowledge of good and evil. What is that exactly?
That's probably one of the most debated aspects. What kind of knowledge are we talking about?
Yeah.
Is it moral independence? Like the ability to decide right and wrong for themselves apart from God?
Or is it simpler? Like noticing they're naked? Self-awareness? Maybe even sexual awareness?
Those are all possibilities scholars discuss. Or maybe it's something broader, just understanding life's complexities, its good and its bad sides. Maturity, perhaps?
So, no single easy answer.
Probably not. Our source suggests it might encompass several things. It's definitely a shift away from simple dependence towards, well, moral agency, making choices that have real ethical weight. One source even suggests that it's mainly about a more mature grasp of the world.
Okay. And the serpent again, it just shows up, starts trouble. What's its motivation? Why does it do this? Is it just a plot device?
Its lack of a clear motive is interesting, isn't it? It could just be a literary tool, a way to introduce the element of temptation and doubt.
Just to get the story rolling.
Could be. Or, symbolically, maybe it represents something deeper, like the inherent challenge to divine rules or the seductive power of forbidden knowledge. Without an origin story for the serpent in the text, it stays a bit mysterious.
Okay. Then come the consequences. People call them curses. Pain in childbirth, hard work, eventual death. Are these specific punishments from an angry God? Or are they more like descriptions of how life is now?
That's a key interpretive question. The text frames them as consequences flowing from the choice made.
So not arbitrary punishments.
Less arbitrary punishment, perhaps, and more descriptions of the resulting human condition. Pain, relational struggle, toil, these become the realities of life after that shift in awareness. They're theological ways of explaining the hardships everyone experiences.
Gotcha. Explaining reality and not just assigning blame. Okay, moving to Cain and Abel. Why was Abel's offering accepted and Cain's rejected? The text is famously silent on the reason.
It is frustratingly ambiguous, isn't it? Later traditions, Jewish tradition especially, filled in the gaps. Maybe Abel offered better quality stuff or had a better attitude.
But Genesis itself doesn't say.
Nope, and maybe that's the point. By not giving a reason, the story pushes our focus onto Cain's reaction.
His anger, his jealousy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Rather than the why of the rejection, it's about how Cain handles it. It sets up the tragedy that follows.
Right. And then there's the mark of Cain. Sounds negative, like a brand of shame. But our sources suggest maybe not.
Yeah, that's another common misunderstanding. Later on, it gets associated with being an outcast, with stigma. But in the original context, it actually seems to be a sign of God's protection. God puts it on Cain so that others won't kill him in revenge.
Wow, okay. So protection, not punishment.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Which is a powerful statement about divine mercy, even right after the first murder. It counters that purely negative reading.
Mercy even then. Okay, let's maybe walk through some key moments verse by verse to anchor this. Genesis 3, verses 1 to 5. The serpent arrives.
Yep. And notice how clever it is. It doesn't directly deny God's command at first. It questions it, twists it slightly.
Did God really say?
Exactly. It plants that seed of doubt. And then it suggests God is holding something back, that this fruit will make them like God, knowing good and evil.
Playing on desire.
Desire, maybe a bit of distrust. It's very subtle psychological manipulation, really.
Then 3, verses 6 and 7, they eat. And boom, eyes open, they see they're naked. That's got to be more than just noticing they need clothes, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's that moment of moral awakening we talked about.
Yeah.
Nakedness symbolizes vulnerability, maybe shame, a loss of that prior innocence. They now understand themselves differently, maybe as separate, as potentially judgeable.
A big shift. Then verses 8 to 13, God shows up, asks questions, and the blame game begins instantly.
Yes. And this shows how sin immediately damages relationships. Not just between humans and God, that's obvious, but between the humans themselves.
Adam blames Eve.
And Eve blames the serpent. Nobody steps up and says, yeah, I did it. Responsibility gets deflected. That breakdown is immediate.
Okay, then verses 14 and 15, God addresses the serpent. Verse 15 is often called the proto-evangelium. Why is that significant?
Right, the first gospel. Within Christian interpretation, that verse talking about enmity between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring and the crushing of the serpent's head gets read as a very early hint of Christ's eventual victory over sin and evil.
Ah, okay. A foreshadowing.
That's the traditional Christian reading. In its original context, though, it might have been understood more generally, just about the ongoing struggle between humanity and forces that oppose God, or even just the real-world conflict between humans and snakes.
Got it. Then 16 to 19, the consequences for the woman and the man. Pain, struggle, toil. We said these are more descriptive.
Yeah, they describe the tough realities of life outside that initial state of direct provision. They offer a theological explanation for why childbirth is painful, why farming is hard work, why relationships involve struggle. It connects human hardship to that foundational choice.
Okay. Then verses 20 to 24. Adam names Eve mother of all living. God makes them clothes, which seems kind.
It does. It's often seen as an act of grace, right? Even as they're facing consequences, God still provides for their basic needs. Shows continued care.
And then the expulsion from Eden, locking the way back to the tree of life. That feels final.
It signifies a major shift. They lose that easy access to God's presence and symbolically access to immortality via the tree of life. It's a consequence of their choice for autonomy, but again, maybe not total rejection, more like changed circumstances.
Okay. Let's jump to Genesis 4. Verses 1 to 7, Cain and Abel, the offerings. That unexplained rejection again, what should we focus on there?
Since the text doesn't give us the why about the offerings, it really pushes us to look at Cain's response. God even warns him, right, about sin crouching at the door.
Its desires for you, but you must rule over it.
Exactly. The focus is on Cain's internal state, his anger, his falling face, and the choice he's about to make.
Then verses 8 to 12, the murder happens, and God confronts Cain, asking, "Where is your brother Abel?" It feels very similar to the confrontation in chapter 3.
It really does echo it, doesn't it? That pattern. Sin, divine questioning, attempted evasion, am I my brother's keeper? Then consequence.
And the consequence for Cain involves the ground itself.
Yeah, he's cursed from the ground, the very thing he worked. It won't yield its strength for him anymore. He becomes a wanderer. It mirrors that theme of alienation from creation we saw back in chapter 3.
Then verses 13 to 16, Cain is afraid someone will kill him, and God puts the mark on him for protection. Again, that theme of mercy.
It's striking, isn't it? After such a horrific act, God's response includes protection. It really highlights that tension between divine justice and divine mercy that runs through these stories.
Okay, then the end of chapter 4, verses 17 to 24, we get this sudden genealogy of Cain's descendants. City building, inventions like musical instruments, metalworking, but also Lamech's boast about killing someone. What's going on there?
It shows human civilization developing rapidly. Culture, technology, these things emerge. But notice how it's intertwined with escalating sin.
Lamech's song is pretty brutal.
It is. He boasts about vengeance, far exceeding any offense. It shows how the violence introduced by Cain can spiral. So civilization is presented as, well, a mixed bag. Innovation and progress, yes, but also the potential for greater corruption and violence.
A double-edged sword.
Pretty much.
But then the chapter ends, verses 25-26, with the birth of Seth, Adam and Eve's third son, and then his son Enosh, and people begin to call on the name of the Lord. That feels like a shift, a bit of hope.
It really does. Seth is positioned as a replacement for Abel, a new beginning for the godly line. And that phrase, calling on the name of the Lord, signifies a conscious return to worshiping God, a restoration of that divine human connection.
So after all the darkness, a glimmer.
Exactly. It suggests that despite the brokenness, the path back to relationship with God is still open.
So stepping back, thinking about the original writers, the original audience, what were they trying to achieve with these stories? What were the big takeaways meant to be?
Well, our sources suggest they were grappling with those really basic human questions. Why is there conflict? Why do we die? Why is life so hard? Why do societies develop the way they do?
The big stuff.
The really big stuff. Genesis 3 seems focused on explaining the consequences of human moral choice, how seeking autonomy leads to fractured relationships with God, with each other, with nature itself.
And Genesis 4.
Genesis 4 takes it further. It shows how sin isn't static, it can escalate. From disobedience to jealousy to murder to cycles of vengeance. But alongside that, it keeps showing God's justice, yes, but also God's persistent mercy. Cain isn't just destroyed.
Right. So how would the first people hearing or reading this have taken it? What problems were they trying to solve?
For ancient Israelites, especially maybe during difficult times like exile, these stories would have offered a framework, a way to understand suffering, death, toil, conflict. They weren't random. They had roots in human choices and the structure of the world as shaped by those choices. But crucially, they also offered reassurance. God is still in control, God is just, and God is merciful.
So even in exile, themes of judgment, loss, but also hope for restoration would really hit home.
Absolutely. The stories provided a lens for understanding their own national experience, perhaps.
Fascinating. So beyond the narrative itself, there are some deep theological, even philosophical ideas packed in here. What are some of the really core concepts that stand out?
Oh, several. The whole idea of human freedom and the weight of responsibility is huge. Chapter 3 is all about the cost of moral autonomy. Our choices matter profoundly. Then there's the pervasive impact of sin, how it doesn't just affect the individual, but ripples outward, breaking relationships at every level.
God, family, nature.
Right. But balanced against that is the constant theme of divine justice tempered by mercy. God judges, yes, but doesn't wipe humanity out. There's clothing, the mark of Cain, the line of Seth.
Grace amidst the consequences.
Precisely. And that complex view of civilization in chapter 4 arises from human effort, maybe even linked to Cain's line, yet it's capable of both great good and terrible evil.
And what does it say about being human, fundamentally?
It presents what theologians call theological anthropology, a view of humanity as created in God's image, possessing moral awareness, capable of incredible creativity and love, but also tragically prone to failure, to choosing wrongly. Yet even in failure, not entirely cut off from the divine.
Wow, okay. And of course, people are still reading and interpreting these chapters today. Our sources mention some modern approaches.
Yes, scholarship continues to engage with these texts from all sorts of angles. You have historical critical methods, trying to understand the original context, maybe linking them to national crises in Israel's history.
Okay.
There are literary approaches focusing purely on the storytelling, the structure, the character arcs, the symbolism, like you'd analyze any great piece of literature.
Right.
Feminist readings have been really important, re-examining Eve's role.
Wow.
Questioning traditional interpretations that might have been biased.
Challenging the blame game.
Exactly. Then you have psychological interpretations, seeing the fall maybe as a metaphor for growing up, for the individual's journey from innocence to experience.
Interesting.
And even approaches like evolutionary theism, which try to bridge the gap between these ancient narratives and modern scientific understandings of human origins.
So many different lenses.
Many ways to find meaning in these incredibly rich texts.
It's really clear then that Genesis 3 and 4 are way more than just simple Sunday school stories about apples and snakes.
Oh, far more. They're profound explorations of what it means to be human.
Really grappling with the core issues, aren't they? Freedom, responsibility, alienation.
Alienation, but also grace. That's key. They paint this picture of humanity as, yes, morally accountable, capable of messing things up badly, but ultimately not abandoned. Still held within a framework of divine concern and, sometimes surprising, mercy.
So as we finish up this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to chew on. Think about how these ancient stories about choices, consequences, brokenness, hope, still resonate so powerfully today.
What does that ongoing resonance tell us about the questions they raise? Are they just timeless human dilemmas? Or perhaps think about that tension the text sets up, the tension between our obvious human failings and that persistent, maybe inexplicable hope for something better, something more.